As is so often the case, we have a woman to thank. In this case, a medieval woman. And in this case, for the Feast of Corpus Christi. Juliana of Liège was born in the early 1190s in Liège in Belgium. In that fine European city, there were groups of women dedicated to Eucharistic worship. They lived together, devoted to prayer and to charitable works. Juliana developed a special veneration for the Blessed Sacrament. It was very special to her. And like all such faithful people, she took great comfort from the celebration of Maundy Thursday, which is the feast of the institution of the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. But as we often observe here, she noted that the Maundy Thursday celebration had many other layers to it, as well as that of celebrating the institution of the Eucharist. There's the layers of washing of the disciples' feet, for example. There's then the agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. But she was a purist, our Juliana. She was a true devotee to the Eucharist, and she longed for a feast day outside of Lent that was in its honour. That desire was enhanced, in her case, by a vision of the church under the appearance of a full moon in the sky with one dark spot upon it. She took that spot to signify the absence of a singular focus on the Eucharist during the church's year. She had that vision many times over the subsequent 20 years, but she kept it a secret. When eventually she relayed this vision, this recurring vision, to her confessor, well, he then relayed it to the bishop. At that time, bishops could order feasts in their diocese. So Bishop Robert ordered in 1246 a celebration of Corpus Christi to be held in the diocese each year thereafter on the Thursday after Trinity Sunday. In other words, today. The first such celebration occurred in 1246 in St. Martin's Church, Liège, in that year. And the rest is, of course, history. A rather complex history, though. The Feast of Corpus Christi became rather a rallying point for the different Christian perspectives that there are on the Eucharist. The feast was intended to celebrate the true presence of Christ in the bread and the wine of communion. As it grew in importance, the elements were paraded around churches and then around whole cities in ever more elaborate and devoted displays of faith. At the high mass of the day, the bread itself, placed in an elaborate holder with golden sunbeams coming out all around it, called a monstrance, was used to bless the assembled congregation. It was a moment of high drama and deeply meaningful to those who participated in it, and indeed who still do participate in it. Sandra was reminding me earlier that it's a ceremony often used at Walsingham. But as the debates of the Reformation took hold, many people considered that such displays of the Eucharist were idolatrous. For those who considered the Holy Communion to be no more than just a memorial of Christ's death and passion, it was too great a leap to believe that Christ himself could be present in the bread and the wine. By 1548, the Church of England had abolished the Feast of Corpus Christi altogether, although traditional Catholic worshippers still did it secretly. The 39 Articles of the Church of England specifically forbid the carrying around of the Eucharist for others to gaze upon. And so for centuries within the Anglican Church, the Feast of Corpus Christi has always felt a little bit naughty. To celebrate it with the full pomp and show of a traditional medieval celebration, well, that stands directly in opposition to the intention of the reformers of the church, and it continues to be a topic that divides opinion amongst priests and peoples, even to this day. For my part, well, I think this feast still has value. It's an opportunity for us to focus entirely upon the meaning of this service that, as I said earlier in my introduction, we do twice a week here. And we do so without the distraction, perhaps, of focusing on other texts and other issues. It's an opportunity for each of us to ask ourselves, what does the Eucharist mean to me? What is this service for? What's its fundamental purpose? Why do we do it? And why should we continue doing it? Surprisingly, one of the more profound answers that I found to these questions comes from an atheist. The philosopher Alain de Botton has written a description of what he refers to as the Mass, the Eucharist, the Holy Communion. And it's well worth hearing what he says. It's part of his book, Religion for Atheists, a non-believer's guide to the uses of religion. He argues that atheists need to learn from the church in terms of the way that we bring communities together. He praises the Mass for the way that it brings people together in community around a meal, albeit a symbolic one. De Botton points out that with declining church attendance, we have seen at the same time in our society an exponential rise in the number of restaurants. But, he says, restaurants fail to introduce people to each other, to dispel their mutual suspicions, to break up the clans into which people chronically segregate themselves. The focus in a restaurant is on the food and on the decor and on the people that we've chosen to gather with in the restaurant. Everybody else is a bit of a pain, and we do wish they'd stop talking because we can't quite hear what we're trying to say to each other in our little tight clans. Restaurants rarely enable a focus on extending and deepening connections across the whole community. I can't wait for the day that our Monday club starts up again, as I know some of you can't wait as well. I can see Maddie nodding away there. Yes, absolutely. Why? Because rather than sitting around little individual tables, just talking to one or two people, when our Monday club gather together, they sit around one big table. Everybody talking to everybody else, being in communion with one another. De Botton says of the Mass that those in attendance tend not to be uniformly of the same age, the same race, profession, or education, or income level. They are a random sampling of souls united only by their shared commitment to certain values. The Mass, says de Botton, should inspire visitors to suspend their customary frightened egoism in favor of joyful immersion in a collective spirit. And he says that's an unlikely scenario in the majority of modern community centres, which is true when you think about it. We call them community centres, but actually what they tend to be are centres in which small clans of like-minded people gather to do their thing, largely ignoring or being annoyed by other people in the same centre doing other things. Now, of course, the Holy Communion is much more than a gathering of disparate souls into one body. But it is at least that. For me, it's also the chance to focus for a while on something other than me, other than myself, my needs, my desires. It's a chance to be drawn outwards from my fragile ego and into the life of the eternal Trinity. It's an opportunity to be fed spiritually by the source of all life, so that I may be empowered and inspired to live my life for God and for others. What does the Eucharist mean to you? I'm going to leave you a few moments to ponder that question before we proceed with our service. What does the Eucharist mean to you? Amen.